I hope you can all hear. If you can't hear, just shout out. But anyway, I've always been happy in libraries, though without ever being entirely at ease there. A scene that seems to crop up regularly in the plays that I've written has a character, often a young man, standing in front of a bookcase feeling baffled. He, and occasionally she, is overwhelmed by the amount of stuff that has been written and the ground still to be covered. "How shall I ever catch up?" wails the young Joe Orton in the film script of Prick Up Your Ears. And in the stage play The Old Country, another young man reacts more dramatically by hurling the books to the floor. Orton himself notoriously defaced library books before starting to write books himself. This resentment, which was, I suppose, somewhere mine, had to do with feeling shut out. A library, I used to feel, was like a cocktail party, with everybody standing with their back to me. I could not find a way in. The first library I did find my way into was the Armley Public Library in Leeds, and I nearly called this talk "Tuppence for the Library," because that was what a reader's ticket cost in 1940. Not tuppence a time, or even tuppence a year, but just tuppence. That was all you ever had to pay. It was rather a distinguished building, Art Nouveau, built in 1901, the architect Percy Robinson. And amazingly for Leeds, which is and always has been demolition crazy, it survives and is still used as a library, though whether it will survive the present troubles, I don't like to think. The library was at the bottom of Hall Lane in Armley, the entrance up a flight of marble steps under open arches and through brass railed swing doors. And our family, my dad, my mum, and my brother, who was 3 years older than I am, and me, would be there going to the library together. And I suppose I ought to say before this how I'd learned to read. My brother and I both used to read comics. And I was still on Dandy and Beano, picture-based comics, and he had graduated to text-based comics like Hotspur and Wizard. And when I'd read my comics, I'd lie on the carpet beside him, looking at what he was reading and asking him questions about it, and doubtless being a real pest. And then, and it's maybe telescoped in my mind, but in my mind, suddenly, one day, it began to make sense. And I realized I could read. I was slow at it, but I could make out what he was reading. Now, this was fine, but there were no children's books in the house. There were the books that there were things like do-it-yourself manuals, really, and Everybody's Home Doctor was one of them. But there were no books for children. My mother and father were both readers, but they tended to like books about escape, really. They both, an escape from Leeds particularly. My father had a notion of leaving his job and starting a small holding, and they read books about people who did that. The only book I can remember them actually having was a book called I Haven't Unpacked by William Holt. And this was a book about somebody from Yorkshire who had bought a horse and left his job and just travelled the country with the horse and wrote a book about it. And I think I've still got it somewhere at home. But anyway, there we are about to go into the Armley Public Library, and my mum and dad go straight ahead into the adult section, which is light and airy and inviting, and my brother and I turn right and go into the junior library, which was not inviting at all. A low, dark room made darker by the books, whatever their contents, had been bound in heavy boards of black, brown or maroon, embossed with the stamp of Leeds Public Libraries. This grim packaging was discouraging to a small boy who'd just begun to read, though more discouraging was the huge and ill-tempered, walrus-moustached British Legion commissionaire who was permanently installed there. The spitting image of General Hindenburg, who was pictured on the stamps in my brother's album, he'd lost one or other of his limbs in the trenches, but since he seldom moved from his chair and just shouted, it was difficult to tell which. He was also mixed up in my head with Kitchener of the Kitchener Needs You poster, and the figure in the corner of the Monopoly board of go to jail, go directly to jail. Such veterans of the First War were very much in evidence well into the 1950s. As a child, one encountered them in parks, sitting on benches, and in shelters playing dominoes, generally grumpy and with the war having robbed them of their youth and often their health. The luckier and less disabled ones manned lifts or were posted at the doors of public buildings, a uniformed and bemedalled conciergerie that was more often than not unhelpful, making the most of whatever petty authority they were left invested with. And so it was here, the veterans' only concern to maintain absolute silence, and not at all the mentor one would have chosen to introduce one to the delights of literature. Of the books themselves, I remember little. Henty was well represented, Captain Marryat, books which, whenever I did manage to get into them, only brought home to me that I was not an entirely satisfactory version of the Guinness boy. I suppose somewhere there must have been Enid Blyton, but she too would have been backed in the same funereal but immensely serviceable boards, and so she passed me by too. As it was, the books I best remember reading there were Hugh Lofting's Dr. Dolittle books, which were always well represented, and the delight of them was that there were always more of them. I think at that time, I knew that they were fiction. I knew that a doctor who talked to animals was not a likelihood. But at the same time, part of me thought that Puddleby on the Marsh, which is where Dr. Dolittle lived, I did believe that was a proper place, and that this took place in historical time. But the characters were wonderfully vivid. Polynesia, the talking parrot, Prince Bumpo, and a very mysterious creature, the cat's meat man. I'd never come across a cat's meat man. I didn't know whether the meat was of cats or for cats. We didn't have a cat, so there was, and also my father was a butcher, so if we wanted meat, we could have that. But the cat's meat man remained a mystery to me until the 1990s, when I had to read it for the BBC. Well, I had to read some of the Dr. Dolittle books for the BBC, and I mentioned the fact that I wasn't sure what a cat's meat man was, and I was deluged with letters from, I suppose, older listeners who remembered a cat's meat man, including one woman who said that he was somebody who went round the street shouting out his wares, which were sold, which were long strips of meat tied to a stick, and that as a child she'd once been in, she'd been told not to answer the door, so he rang the bell and put through the letterbox the stick with the strips of meat, and she was so famished she ate the lot. But I didn't. He was totally mysterious to me. Was the cat's meat man? A few years later, in 1944, believing, as people in Leeds tended to do, that things were better down south, my dad threw up his job with the co-op and we migrated to Guildford. It was a short-lived experiment, and I don't remember even ever finding the public library there, but this was because a few doors down from the butcher's where my father worked, there was a little private library costing sixpence a week, which in the children's section had all Richmal Crompton's William books. I devoured them, reading practically one a day, happy in the knowledge that there would always be more. Years later, when I first read a book by Evelyn Waugh, I had the same feeling. Here was a trove of books that was going to last. I wish I could say I felt the same about Dickens or Trollope or Proust even, but they seemed more of a labour, whereas these were a prospect of endless delight. And I used to take the books everywhere. My father worked for a butcher called Mr. Banks, who also ran a horse meat business, which was, I suppose, meat for cats and dogs. But it was always had to be painted bright green so that it couldn't be sold for human consumption. But he had a big lorry, and I used to hang about hoping he would take me along in the lorry when he went out to pick up a carcass, which he sometimes did. And we'd go out around Guildford, and there in the middle of a field would be the inflated body of a horse or a cow, which would be winched into the lorry, and then I'd go back with them and they to the slaughterhouse, which was in Walnut Tree Close in Guildford, where they dismembered the body. And I'd sit in the corner of the slaughterhouse with my William book, not thinking it at all peculiar that here was this very grisly scene going on, and it made no impression on me at all. I was far more interested in my book. But I suppose when you're a child, you just assume that everything is normal. But anyway, we didn't stay long in Guildford. We went back to Leeds at the end of 1945 and ended up living in Headingley. The public library there on North Lane, a visit to which could be combined with seeing the film at the Lounge cinema opposite. I went to Leeds Modern School, a state school up at Lawnswood, and still there in a different building, but now called Lawnswood School. I spoke there a few months ago, and I found it still a good school, though it's failed its Ofsted inspection, whatever that means, but is still managing, I'm glad to say, to resist the siren charms of academy status and Mr. Gove. In the evenings, when I got into the sixth form, I used to work at the Leeds City Reference Library in the Hedgerow. At that time, the municipal buildings housed not only the lending library and the reference library, but also the education offices and the police department, which I suppose was handy for the courts, which still functioned across the road in the town hall. The whole complex, town hall, library, art gallery, was an expression of the confidence of the city and its belief in the value of reading and education and where you might end up if they were neglected. It's a high Victorian building, done throughout in polished Bermontoft's brick, extravagantly tiled, the staircases of polished marble topped with brass rails, and carved at the head of each stair a slavering dog looking as if it's trying to stop itself sliding backwards down the banister. If you've ever got half an hour to spare in Leeds, go in and see the building. It is the most wonderful building. The reference library itself proclaimed the substance of the city, with its solid elbow chairs and long mahogany tables, grooved along the edge to hold a pen, and in the centre of each table a massive pewter inkwell. Arched and galleried and lined from floor to ceiling with books, the reference library was grand yet unintimidating. Half the tables were filled with sixth formers like myself, just doing their homework or studying for a scholarship. There would be university students home for the vacation, though the Leeds students tended to work up the road in their own Brotherton library. There were, too, the usual quota of eccentrics that haunt any reading room that is warm and handy and has somewhere to sit down. Old men would doze for hours over a magazine taken from the rack, though if they were caught nodding off, an assistant would trip over from the counter and hiss, "No sleeping." One regular, always with a pile of art books at his elbow, was the painter Jacob Kramer, some of whose paintings, with their vortices slant, hung in the art gallery next door. Kramer has a connection with Primrose Hill in that he was the brother-in-law of a more distinguished painter and vorticist, William Roberts, who lived at St. Mark's Crescent. Dirty and half-tight, there wasn't much to distinguish him from the other tramps whiling away their time before trailing along Victoria Street to spend the night in the Refuge in the basement of St. George's Church, where occasionally I would do night duty myself, sleeping on a camp bed in a room full of these sad, defeated, utterly unthreatening creatures. With its mixture of readers and its excellent facilities, and the knowledge that there would always be someone working there whom I knew and who would come out for coffee, I found some of the pleasure going to the reference library there that, had I been less studious, I could have found in a pub. Over the next 10 years, while I still thought I might turn into a medieval historian, I became something of a connoisseur of libraries, but the reference library in Leeds always seemed to me one of the most congenial. It was there, on leave from the army during my national service, that I discovered that they held a run of Horizon, the literary magazine started by Cyril Connolly in 1940, and that I eventually did get a scholarship to Oxford I put down to the smattering of culture I gleaned from its pages. In my day, it was a predominantly male institution, with the main tables dividing themselves almost on religious or ethnic lines. There was a Catholic table, patronised by boys from St. Michael's College, the leading Catholic school, with blazers in bright Mary blue. There was a Jewish table, where the boys came from Roundy or the grammar school. The Jewish boys, even when they were not at the same school, often knowing each other from the synagogue or other extracurricular activities. And if, like me, you were at the modern school, and there were about half a dozen of us who went there regularly, one had no particular religious or racial affinities, and indeed were not thought perhaps quite as clever. The school was certainly not as good as Roundhay or the grammar school. The few girls who braved this male citadel disrupted this formal division, leavened it, I'm sure, for the better, and they worked harder than the boys, who were seldom to be found, and were seldom to be found on the landing outside, where one adjourned for a smoke. It had glamour too for me, and getting in first at 9 one morning, I felt as I opened my books, as I did as a small boy at Armley Baths, when I was first in there, the one to whom it fell to break the immaculate stillness of the water, shatter the straight lines tiled on the bottom of the bath, and set the day on its way. Of the boys who worked there, a surprising number must have turned out to be lawyers, though one had no notion of that at the time. And I can count at least 8 of my contemporaries who sat at those tables in the 50s, who are now judges or now retired judges. A school, and certainly a state or a provincial state school, would consider that something to boast about. But libraries are facilities. A library has no honours board and takes no credit for what its readers go on to do. But remembering myself at 19, on leave from the army and calling up the copies of Horizon to get me through the general paper, I feel as much a debt to that library as I do to my school. It was a good library, and though, like everywhere else, busier now than it was in my day, remains, unlike so much of Leeds, largely unaltered. The library closed at 9 at night, and coming down in the lift, beveled mirrors, mahogany panelling, little bench, the attendant, another British Legion figure, would stop and draw the gates at the floor below, which was the police department, and in would get a covey of policemen, and even the occasional miscreant en route for the cells. One of the policemen might be my cousin Arnold, who belonged to what my mother always felt was the more common wing of the Bennett family. Loud, burly, and wonderfully genial, Arnold was a police photographer, and he would regale me with the details of the latest murder he'd been called upon to snap. By Alan, I've seen some stuff. The stuff he'd seen included the death of the stripper Mary Millington, who had committed suicide. I can't understand why she committed suicide. She had a beautiful body. To someone as prone to embarrassment as I was, these encounters, particularly in the presence of my school friends, ought to have been shaming. That they never were was, I suppose, because Cousin Arnold was looked on as a creature from the real world, the world of prostitutes found dead on waste ground, of corpses in copses, and cars burned out down lovers' lanes. This was life, where I knew even then that I was not likely to be headed or ever to have much to do with. There's no shortage of libraries in Oxford, some of them, of course, of great grandeur and beauty. The Radcliffe Camera seems to me one of the handsomest buildings in England, and the square in which it stands a superb combination of styles. Crossing it on a moonlit winter's night lifted the heart, though that was often the trouble with Oxford. The architecture outsoared one's feelings, the sublime not always easy to match. There are, in that one square, 3 libraries: the Bodleian on the north side, on the east the Codrington, part of Hawksmoor's All Souls, and James Gibbs' Camera in the middle. There's actually another library, a modest little library, neo-Gothic, built in 1856 by the architect George Gilbert Scott, which is over Exeter Garden Wall in the northwest corner, but you can't quite see it. Exeter was my college, and that was where I worked, though it was possible, if one was so inclined, to get to study in the much more exclusive and architecturally splendid surroundings of the Codrington, and a few undergraduates did so. They tended, though, to set less store on what they were reading or writing than on where they were reading or writing it, and I, with my narrow sympathies, but who was just as foolish, despised them for it. Staying on at Oxford after I'd taken my degree, I did research in medieval history. The subject of my research, Richard II's retinue in the last 10 years of his reign. This took me twice a week to the Public Record Office, then still in Chancery Lane, and in particular to the Round Room, galleried, lined with books, a humbler version of the much grander Round Room in the British Museum. Presiding over the British Museum Round Room in his early days was Angus Wilson, whereas at the PRO it was Noel Blakiston, Etonian friend of Cyril Connolly, hair as white as Wilson's, and possibly the most distinguished-looking man I'd ever seen. Though I made copious notes on the manuscripts I studied, which was chiefly records of the medieval exchequer, I would have found it hard to say what it was I was looking for. Imagining, I think, that having amassed sufficient material, it would all suddenly fall into place and become clear. Failing that, I hoped to come upon some startling and unexpected fact, a very silly notion. Had it been Richard III I was researching rather than Richard II, I might have been hoping to come across something as relatively unambiguous as a note in the monarch's own hand saying, "It was me that killed ye princes in ye tower." He. Historical research nowadays is a dull business. Had I had any sense, I would have been collating the tax returns of the knights I was studying, or the amount they borrowed or were owed. That, or sifting through material other historians had ignored or discarded. As in many disciplines, both scientific and historical, it's seldom at the frontier that discoveries are made, but more often in the dustbin. The memoranda rolls, on which I spent much of my time, were long, thin swatches of parchment, about 5 foot long and about 18 inches wide, and written on both sides. Thus, to turn the page required the cooperation and forbearance of most of the other readers at the table. So it would sometimes look like the cast of the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, struggling to put wallpaper up when all I was doing was to try to turn over. One side effect of reading these unwieldy documents was that one was straight away propelled into quite an intimate relationship with readers alongside, and one of those I got to know in this way was the historian Cecil Woodham Smith. The author of The Great Hunger, an account of the Irish famine and the reason why, the events leading up to the charge of the Light Brigade, Cecil was a frail woman with a tiny bird-like skull, looking more like Elizabeth I in later life than Edith Sitwell ever did, who used to boast about it. But Cecil had the advantage, she didn't go in for the sheet metal earrings that Edith Sitwell affected. And she did look exactly like the tomb of Elizabeth I in Westminster Abbey. Irish, she had a Furbankian wit and a lovely turn of phrase. "Do you know the Atlantic at all?" she once asked me. And I put the line in habeas corpus and got a big laugh on it. From a grand Irish family, I think she was an O'Neill, she was quite snobbish. And talking of someone, she said, "Then he married a Mitford, but that's a stage everybody goes through." Even the most ordinary remark would be given her own particular twist, and she could be quite camp. Conversation had once turned, as conversations will, to forklift trucks. Feeling that industrial machinery might be remote from Cecil's sphere of interest, I said, "Do you know what a forklift truck is?" She said, "I do, to my cost." Books and bookcases crop up in the stuff that I've written, and this means that they have to be reproduced on stage or on film. This isn't as straightforward as it might seem. A designer will either present you with shelves lined with gilt tool library sets, the sort of Clubland books one can rent by the yard as decor, or he or she will send out for some junk books from the nearest second-hand bookshop and think that those will do. Another shortcut is to send out for a cargo of remaindered books, so that you end up with a shelf so garish and lacking in character, it bears about as much of a relationship to literature as a caravan site does to architecture. A bookshelf is as particular to its owner as are his or her clothes. A personality is stamped on a library just as a shoe is shaped by a foot. That someone's working library shelves have a particular tone, with some shelves more heterogeneous than others, for instance, or in the case of an art historian filled with off-prints and monographs, or with an old-fashioned literary figure, shelves lined with the faded covers and jackets of distinctive Faber or Cape editions, none of this seems to occur to a designer. Even designers who are very scrupulous, and I won't mention any names, do have a blind spot about bookshelves. And on 2 occasions at least, I've had to take my own books down to Shaftesbury Avenue to give the right tone to the shelves. I had to do this for a play, The Old Country, at the Queen's. The books there, which were Auden, Spender and McNeice, of central importance to the plot. I wanted the faded buffs and blues and yellows bleached into a unity of tone by long sunlit Cambridge afternoons, the kind of books you might find lining Dady Ryland's rooms, for instance, in King's. Anthony Blunt's bookshelves were crucial in Single Spies. The look of an art historian's bookshelf significantly different from those of a literary critic, say. More folio volumes, folders, off-prints, and this too passed the designer by. One knows that this does sound rather carping, but it's one of the a lifetime in the theatre remains with me. One knows that designers seldom read, but they don't have much knowledge of Inca civilization either, or the Puritan settlement of New England, and yet they seem to cope perfectly well reproducing them. An agglomeration of books, as illustrating the character of their owner, seems to defeat them. And I noticed there's a play on this. I'm maligning whoever it is designed it, but I noticed that there's a play, Botley is on, the play by Simon Gray has been revived, and there's a bookshelf there I noticed in a photograph, and that didn't look quite right. It looked a bit too, far too many of the books had jackets on. And a Don's library tended to have lost its jackets in my experience, but anyway. When I first bought books for myself in the late 40s, they were still thought to be quite precious, and in poor homes, books might often be backed in brown paper. Paper itself was in short supply, and such new books as there were often bore the imprint produced in accordance with the authorised economy standard. The paper was mealy, slightly freckled, and looked not unlike the texture of the ice cream of the period. It was, though, a notable period in book design, and perhaps because they were among the first books I ever bought, one was C.B. Wedgwood's William the Silent, the books of that time have always seemed to me all that was necessary or desirable, simple, unfussy, wholesome, and well-designed. And books of the 40s and early 50s are still to me immensely appealing. They were not, though, to be left about at home. Books do furnish a room, wrote Anthony Powell, but my mother never thought so, and she'd always put them out of the way in the sideboard when you weren't looking. Books untidy, books upset, more her view, and with the potential for infection, and not intellectual infection either. Lurking among the municipally owned pages might be the germs of TB or scarlet fever, so one must never be seen to peer at a library book too closely or lick your finger before turning the page, particularly if you were reading such a book in bed. There were other perils in reading, but it was only when I hit middle age that I became aware of them. Me, I'm Afraid of Virginia Woolf was a television play written in 1978, and though it doesn't contain my usual scene of someone baffled at a bookcase, the sense of being outfaced by books is a good description of what the play is about. Hopkins, I wrote of the middle-aged lecturer who is the hero, Hopkins was never without a book. It wasn't that he was particularly fond of reading, he just liked to have somewhere to look. A book makes you safe, shows you're not out to pick anybody up, try it on. With a book you're harmless, though Hopkins was harmless without a book. Books as badges, books as shields. One doesn't think of libraries as perilous places where you can come to harm. Still, they do carry their own risks. Of the libraries I've talked about, the one that was most important was the first one, the Armley Public Library, where I went when I was 6. And I think that's worth remembering today when the libraries are under threat. The local library I'm most familiar with is obviously Sharples Hall Street. And when I go by there, it's often, particularly after school or in the holidays, thronged with small children. They counter the arguments that have been put forward that nobody needs libraries now, because these are probably children, a lot of them are children from the flats who don't have computers and who can only keep up with their classmates by seeing the computers in the library. And it's been, I think I've been said to be condescending to say this. I don't think it's condescending. I see those children as myself when I was 6 years old. And they're in the same position now as then, all of 60 years, 70 years ago. The other thing that's not been emphasized enough is that a library is a place. It's not just a resource. That many of those children will go there because it's the only place where they can have a bit of peace and quiet and have the place to themselves and have a book to themselves. And that's crucial, I think. It's not a political matter. All the parties have disgraced themselves, in my view, on this. The Labour Party particularly, which has such a long tradition of self-education and support for the libraries, it's disgraceful that hasn't come out more. The Tories, it's been on, privatisation has been on the agenda for a long time. I wrote something in a diary for the London Review of Books about this. Switch on Newsnight to find some bright spark from, guess where, the Adam Smith Institute, proposing the privatisation of public libraries. His name is Eamon Butler, and it's to be hoped he's no relation of the 1944 Education Act butler. Smirking and pleased with himself, as they generally are from that stable, he's pitted against a well-meaning but flustered woman who's an authority on children's books. Paxman looks on, undissenting, as this odious figure dismisses any defence of the tradition of free public libraries as the usual bleating of the middle classes. I go to bed depressed, only to wake and find Madsen Pirie, also from the Adam Smith Institute for the Criminally Insane, banging the same drum in The Independent. Not long ago, John Bird and John Fortune did a sketch about the privatisation of air. These days, it scarcely seems unthinkable. Now, that was written in 1996, in the last hectic days of privatisation, which landed us with the railway system that we have now. And so it was obviously on the agenda then, and so I tend to think that with the Tories anyway, the financial crisis is just an opportunity to do what they've always wanted to do, but there's no such excuse for the Labour Party. I'm not a campaigner, and I'm not a tub thumper, and I'm not very good at it, but it is something I feel passionate about. And everybody, I think, should, if they can, support the campaign to save our library and to save other libraries which are probably in less fortunate areas than where we live. Well, that's all I've got to say, but I'm very happy now to answer questions both about libraries or about anything, really, about anything I've written. And maybe be a bit funnier. I know that wasn't very funny.
As we're in a church building, Alan, I know that you have a love of old churches. I just wondered what feelings does it generate within you when you're walking around them?
Well, I'm used to being in churches simply because one of the things I used to do when I was a boy was go look at churches, old churches particularly, of which Leeds doesn't have many really, but I used to do that until I was in my 20s, and then I lost the habit. And then when I met my partner, Rupert Thomas, he's more keen than I am, and so we do spend a lot of time going around churches. Although he's much more, I'm more of a, I'm a residual member of the Church of England. So, but he's much more atheistical than I am, and so he doesn't like churches where there's much evidence of religion. So that rather limits us anyway.
There's another question here.
And you were talking about the contemporaries of yours who have gone on to, presumably not all of them were judges, but other things as well. That school that you went to, do you think it's now a sort of lack of aspiration, or when you went there, do you think those children you were talking to are also going to become perhaps judges or other sort of have aspiration to those sort of group of children that you were with as a child?
Well, as I say, I went back to my old school about 3 or 4 months ago, and there seemed to me to be aspirational there, and the teachers were. I mean, you felt guilty in a way that the teachers were so keen and so eager, because they have such a bad time, and my school has been given a bad time because it won't take up academic status, and there are neighbouring schools which get all the attention and most of the funds, which are, so they still seem to me to be aspirational. I suppose I never thought of us as being particularly aspirational, I have to say, when I was young, and though, as I say, 8 of my contemporaries became judges, there were some very surprising ones among them, and particularly the ones, some of the people who were at Leeds went to the same college as I did, and as you lose touch with them, but you know, the people who, the last sight you had of them was after examination schools when they were lying half naked and drunk on the lawn. And the next time you see them, they're in court and maybe even knighted. And so it's very, very strange. But I don't know. My sympathies are always go to the unendowed places, really. I passionately believe that private education is wrong. It is just not fair. And I don't believe that this country will ever tap its proper resources until that is recognised and until there is some sort of amalgamation between private education and state education. It could have been done just after the Butler Education Act in 1944. It could have been done as part of all the legislation that came about when Labour came in 1945. It could have been done, or a beginning made in 1997. And it would seem to me not to be difficult to envisage, for instance, that sixth form education in state schools should be amalgamated with sixth form education in public schools. That doesn't seem to me to be too much to hope for. But there's been no movement at all, and the no movement under the last government, and there will certainly be none under this one. There've been all the talk of everybody pulling their weight. No mention has been made of the public schools pulling their weight. I know I shall never see it, but it remains one of the things I'm not particularly radical, but about that I am, really.
I just wondered if you still felt an outsider from literature and culture, or whether you now feel part of the game.
Do I still feel an outsider from it? Yes, is the answer. And it may seem absurd, but I tend to think that in literary circles, I'm regarded as somebody from the theatre, and in theatrical circles, I'm slightly tinged by being to do with literature. I've always found and still think that the theatrical world is nicer and kinder than the literary world, which I don't really see a great deal of. And I'm happy to be, as it were, an outsider in that sense. But it's also, in my work, the short story, when I started to write short stories, they were always stories which wanted to be plays, and I couldn't make them into plays, and so they became stories. So they still, as it were, have one foot in the theatrical world. But I very seldom go to literary parties, and I've had occasional literary prizes, and the nice thing about literary prizes, as distinct from theatrical ones, is that they come with money attached. You know, I won the Hawthornden Prize, and I can't remember how much it was, but there was some money attached to it. You never get any money for the Evening Standard Award or the Olivier, you know, just get another hideous statuette. Anyway.
You mentioned when you were talking about your family moving from Leeds to Guildford and back again because we're hoping for almost a better life. Do you think there's any such thing as the North-South divide? And if so, what is it?
Well, I wouldn't want to, if there is, I wouldn't want to do anything about it. It adds to the the variety of things. I don't know whether there is. They're more sceptical, it seems to me. When I go home to Leeds every fortnight or so, and I'm always relieved that they all talk like I do. But they're also quite sceptical. Last time I went, I was getting off the train and a man said, aren't you Alan something? And I said, yeah, well, yes, I am. He said, Scarborough. And I said, no, that's a different Alan. And he said, well, which Alan are you? And I said, well, I'm another Alan. I said, are you just a look-alike? And I said, well, yes, I am really. He said, and he patted my arm. He said, well, be happy with it. And so I can't imagine that happening down south, really.
What I'd like to ask you, Alan, is what book would you take with you onto a desert island?
I've done desert island once in 1966, and the reason I've refused to do it again is because I can't answer questions like this, really. I don't know, really. The book I would go back to again and again, simply because I forget it as soon as I've read it, are the Diaries of James Lees Milne, which isn't the kind of book I would expect myself to like, because it's snobbish and catty and gossipy, but I do find it endlessly entertaining. But that's not a very elevating answer, really.
I imagine that your house is a rather wonderful library, and I was wondering if you know what books you've got and how you actually enjoy them.
I know I've got them, but I don't know where they are. And I feel persecuted by books, really, because there's so many of them. And I get sent books. You get sent books now in the hope that you'll, free by the publishers, in the hope that you'll give a quote for the jacket. And so I get mounting piles of books which I haven't chosen, but which have been, as it were, wished on me. And I find it very difficult to put them in the recycling bag. I feel sure that there's a better way of doing it. But I find I read the same books again and again. It's not you're delighted when you find a new author. I'm now reading what's his initials? Is it C.J. Sansom, the man who writes about the Tudors? I find his books very good, though they're quite depressing. But I tend to, if a book is all the rage, I tend to wait until the heat's gone off it before I read it, really. I don't like to be in the forefront with books. And that's, I don't know, that's not a very praiseworthy characteristic, but it's slightly the feeling of, well, go on, prove it, But I am reading a book which people... it's also, when people recommend books to me, that puts me against them. I've been persecuted all my life by people saying I would like Jane Austen. Now, I've read some Jane Austen, but not all. And it's because I just don't want to be the kind of person who would like Jane Austen. But the book I am reading, which people have recommended, is the book about Netsky, the Hare with Amber Eyes, which I started off, I had to really work at it. I didn't like the beginning, but now I'm much more into it. And that is good.
And ironically, last week, the headline in the Evening Standard, which I feel is hypocrisy, said 1 in 3 children, primary school children, do not have access to a book at home. We let those things drop, cuts made. If we let the libraries continue to be cut, the situation will only get worse.
Well, I can only say I endorse that, yes, no, absolutely. But I don't know, you come up against the other occasion when I've spoken about libraries, it was at keeping the Kensal Rise Library up. And they've bent over backwards to keep their library open. And they've worked out solutions and offered to maintain it with their own staff and so on and so forth. And they've come up against a blank wall. And it's to do with the bureaucratic mind and also the sense that they're in charge, as it were. And they say, as they say in Brent, which Kensal Rise is under, that they're planning a spanking new central library. Now, this sounds very good, and I'm sure this has been said in many parts of the country. Now, but that is not an answer. A library should be local. It should be handy. It shouldn't require a child, and I think particularly of the children, it shouldn't require a child to have to make an expedition to go to it. It should be round the corner, where they can go themselves without being overseen. These obvious things are they're not said, and they're thought to be, as in that quote, the middle class is being well-meaning. Something that's not been raised, or I've not seen it raised much, is if the libraries are closed, what happens to the buildings? Now, there was after the Kensal Rise meeting, there was an item on Newsnight. He was a jerk, really. I can't remember, some institute of political economy or whatever, but he let fall the revealing phrase, they were valuable retail outlets. And you felt, well, this is something else which has not been revealed. And that, again, one would be ashamed to think Labour councils would do exactly the same thing, that it's a windfall, and they wouldn't be able to resist it, really. This is the thing I've been sneered at for saying, that closing down libraries is a form of child abuse, because you hinder a child's development by denying it resources for it to expand, and it's the worst thing you can do. But one feels, with all due respect, this exercise has just made me feel so inadequate because I know so little about it. I just know in my heart that it's wrong, and I can't, that seems an inadequate thing to say. But one has to stand up and be counted, really. I'm going to read from the Uncommon Reader, just to finish off with, which is just about the Queen. If you don't know the book, it's the Queen by accident strays into a mobile library which she finds parked at the back of Buckingham Palace, and out of politeness, really, she takes out a book, and because she's the sort of person who, if she starts a book, she finishes it. She finishes it, although it's Ivy Compton Bennett and quite hard to finish. And then she goes again to take the book back and finds a better book, Nancy Mitford's Pursuit of Love. And she gradually begins to read. And as she reads, her whole attitude to life changes. And this is her private secretary, who doesn't approve of her reading, is a New Zealander, and he doesn't like her reading at all. I can understand, said Sir Kevin, your Majesty needs to pass the time. Pass the time, said the Queen. Books are not about passing the time. They're about other lives, other worlds. Far from wanting time to pass, Sir Kevin, one just wishes one had more of it. If one wanted to pass the time, one could go to New Zealand. With two mentions of his name, he doesn't like being called Kevin. With two mentions of his name and one of New Zealand, Sir Kevin retired, hurt. Still, he had made a point, and he would have been gratified to know that it left the Queen troubled and wondering why it was that at this particular time in her life she had suddenly felt the pull of books. Where had this appetite come from? Few people, after all, had seen more of the world than she had. There was scarcely a country she had not visited, a notability she had not met. Herself part of the panoply of the world, why now was she intrigued by books which, whatever else they might be, were just a reflection of the world or a version of it? Books? She had seen the real thing. "I read, I think," she said to Norman, "because one has a duty to find out what people are like." A trite enough remark of which Norman took not much notice, feeling himself under no such obligation, and reading purely for pleasure, not enlightenment, though part of the pleasure was the enlightenment, he could see that, but duty did not come into it. To someone with the background of the Queen, though, pleasure had always taken second place to duty. If she could feel she had a duty to read, then she could set about it with a clear conscience, with the pleasure, if pleasure there was, incidental. But why did it take possession of her now? This she did not discuss with Norman, as she felt it had to do with who she was and the position she occupied. The appeal of reading, she thought, lay in its indifference. There was something lofty about literature. Books did not care who was reading them or whether one read them or not. All readers were equal, herself included. Literature, she thought, is a commonwealth, letters a republic. Actually, she'd heard this phrase, the Republic of Letters, used before at graduation ceremonies, honorary degrees and the like, though without knowing quite what it meant. At that time, talk of a republic of any sort she thought mildly insulting, and in her actual presence tactless, to say the least. It was only now she understood what it meant. Books did not differ. All readers were equal, and this took her back to the beginning of her life. As a girl, one of her greatest thrills had been on VE night, when she and her sister had slipped out of the gates and mingled unrecognized with the crowds. There was something of that, she felt, to reading. It was anonymous, it was shared, it was common. And she, who had led a life apart, now found that she craved it. Here in these pages and between these covers, she could go unrecognized. These doubts and self-questionings, though, were just the beginning. Once she got into her stride, it ceased to seem strange to her that she wanted to read, and books, to which she'd taken so cautiously, gradually came to be her element.